Good evening. I'm Mark Halperin, and this beat is Two-Way Tonight. Thank you. Welcome to the Two-Way platform, where our ethos is peace, love, and understanding, the presumption of grace for all, and mass confusion over how America feels about the use of Signal by senior Trump officials. It's still a big story and will lead every newscast, and yet many people in the administration and on this platform think we should never talk about it again. Very confusing to me. It's a big story, and I'll give you some illustrations about why I think it's a big story. But tonight, we'll spend a lot of our time talking to a guy named Steve Hilton, familiar to many of you, commentator, analyst, activist, writer with a new book out about California called Califailure. I'm going to talk to him about that title. Califailure, Reversing the Ruin of America's Worst Run State. So I'll run through the headlines. We'll play some sound bites from things that happened today on a few issues, some incredibly compelling video of the Vice President of the United States that I think you'll enjoy seeing if you haven't seen it yet. And then we'll talk to Steve Hilton about California and about national politics and about the world. Again, a very, very compelling guy. Want to preview a few things for you. Tomorrow, being Thursday, Sean Dan and I will be here at 9 o'clock for Two-Way the morning meeting. Immediately after that, at 10 o'clock Eastern time, opportunity to talk about the economy with David Bahnsen, the Bahnsen Group, David's firm, sponsor of the program. Always recommend his newsletter, Dividend Cafe, that David writes daily. Gives you a lot of insight into the economy. President Trump today announced 25% auto tariffs in advance of the big tariff announcement expected next week. Still not entirely clear to me why he did autos today. Markets were down today. You can put that up. Now, that came before the auto announcements, which came after the close. Perhaps people were anticipating this. Don't know exactly. But in any event, tomorrow, 10 o'clock Eastern time, AM. Not available on YouTube, not available on X. This is for the Two-Way community only here on the Two-Way platform. So if you want to be part of the conversation, David and I will chat a bit, but really it's mostly for your questions. So if you want to get David's insight and analysis and perspective on what's going on with the economy currently, where are things headed, the tariffs, tax cuts, loads of uncertainty, and all the unrest around the world, join us by going to tway.tv/TBG for the Bahnsen Group, tway.tv/TBG, in order to sign up to attend the event. And again, don't go looking for it on YouTube. This is for the Two-Way community. Come on the platform and be with us at 10 a.m. tomorrow. And also tomorrow, Mike Moynihan's show is on 4 o'clock Eastern time, the Moynihan Report, and then I'll be back with this show, sponsored by the Bahnsen Group, in about 23 hours and however many minutes. So 4 things you can watch tomorrow. Two-Way, it's the morning meeting, then me and David Bahnsen at 10 a.m., Michael at 4, and then me again at 6. 4 hours of your day devoted just to this platform. Thank you all for making yourselves available with such generosity. That's about a sixth of your day. In any event, you know what? I'm not going to start with the Signal stuff because I'm going to talk to Mr. Hilton about that. I just got to show you the vice president. He went to Quantico today and he gave some remarks. But before I show you his remarks, number 7, Sam, it's just something you don't see every day. Here's the Vice President of the United States laying down some fire at Quantico. I'm just going to watch the whole thing. Nothing much different happens except this, but that's the Vice President of the United States.
Ready? One more station for you.
All right. Now, the guy has what the British call joie de vivre. And if you like that and you're a Vance fan, watch this. This will be number 8. This is the vice president at Quantico giving his remarks. And this is just old school oratory. Check it out.
No more quotas, no more ridiculous mumbo jumbo, no more diversity trainings. We believe the real strength and the real diversity in the United States Marine Corps is that you all come from every walk of life, come from every corner of America, and you have got the strength and the purpose to win the nation's wars. And that is what the Marine Corps is going to do, just like it's done for damn near 250 years.
All right. Vice President's one of the great, most interesting stories from a journalistic point of view of this administration so far. And so let's start there with our guest this evening, the great Steve Hilton. Mr. Hilton, welcome in. Thank you for joining after you unmute. Couldn't be more pleased to have you here on the occasion of the publication of your book, Cali Failure, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Yeah. Welcome in. I've been thinking all day, I've been composing a list in my head. I'm here in Covent Garden, was at the Sainsbury buying some some groceries.
I'm saying Sainsbury now. In fact, I used to say Sainsbury back in England just to wind people.
So I was thinking of all the things you and I have in common, and I made a list of like 100 things. Okay. Just for example, both of us say, how much better do the restaurants in London need to get before you can buy a proper avocado to make edible guacamole? Like the food here is now so good, and yet you cannot buy a proper avocado. That's one of 100. Another thing is you and I in our daily lives are often asked on camera to talk about everything. Like the bookers will be like, we're going to talk about this and this. Then you show up and it's like, we want to know what you think of Taylor Swift, right? So we have the capacity to pretend to be experts on everything. But you, sir, are a great expert. And I want to talk about California. But let's just start. Welcome in. Thank you for joining. Tell us about your relationship with the vice president. How well do you know him? What do you think of him?
So just one thing I want to say, by way of introduction, it's a great joy for me to be here, not least because I just love, in the face of all this going on, Mark, you're so calm. Just your voice, the way you run the show, it's such a soothing interlude in the crazy.
It's because of this stuff. It's because of this. Amazing. Calms me down. Thank you for saying so.
And when I do try to be calm. When you were listing the 100 things, I thought you could say, wait, he's not Hungarian as well, is he?
No, but my ancestors are also from Eastern Europe, so we have that in common as well.
Another one for the list. So look, JD, funnily enough, I did get to know JD very early on in his trajectory because it was 2016, and it was just at the onset of what we now think of as the populist revolution in politics, and we moved here 2012 from England. As you can tell, I still have the accent, but just want to reassure everyone watching, I'm an American now. I am a citizen, proud to be one, proud Californian as well. But in 2016, I went back to the UK for a while to campaign in favor of Brexit. And Brexit was, of course, the first sign that something interesting was going on. And it was also just around that time that Hillbilly Elegy was published. And JD and I found ourselves on a number of occasions on panels or speaking to Republican conferences or meetings, whatever it may be, trying to explain what was going on, because we were both keyed into this fact, which really struck me when I was writing a previous book called More Human, which was published in 2015. And that's when I really started thinking about all this in the context of the data that I uncovered about how incomes had basically been flat for most people in America since the 1970s, that sort of famous piece of data, which JD also cites often. So I've known him since then. I live in the Bay Area with my family, and JD for a while was there, of course, as working in venture capital, Peter Thiel's company. So we met a few times and then lost touch a little bit. And more recently have gotten back in touch, and I've gotten in touch with some of the people around him. So I know him a little bit. I wouldn't overstate that. The main thing, just to finish, would be I think of him as just an incredibly warm and decent human being, honestly. That's my sort of overriding impression of him.
Yeah. So I agree with you. And I think he's in some ways misunderstood in part because people don't understand that he's a warm person. But the other thing, and if I ever have 20 minutes, I'm going to write this piece. Bill Clinton in the 80s and 90s, really the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, was part of something that Sidney Blumenthal,
Hmm.
the former New Republic writer and wrote other places, he called the conversation. And
Hmm.
he said Bill and Hillary were at the center of the conversation where they governors associations, academia, different democratic groups, just this conversation, part intellectual, part policy, part politics, part media. They just sort of talked a lot to really smart people about where was the country now, where was it headed.
Hmm.
And I think that JD Vance has been at the center of a new and different kind of conversation that
Right.
you've been part of as well, which is this populist, muscular attempt to think about things in a way to reorder.
Hmm.
And and as I've said many times, I'll keep using the line until somebody tells me I'm using it too much. He speaks MAGA with a suburban accent. And he makes the ideas that animate the movement accessible to intellectuals, suburban parents, working class voters in a way that derives, I think, in part from his central role in the conversation. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. I agree, and I think that I mean it's interesting when you put it that way. That word muscular is interesting. I use that a lot now in the context of what I think we need in California to make the changes that we can talk about in a minute. But in
Yep.
terms of JD, I think that's right, and I think he was there early, and I think it's interesting that you bring out that consistency because I think he has been consistent. People have pointed out, they've thrown the quotes back at him about Trump during the first campaign, and that fair enough, but I think he really was talking. I believe him. I believe JD when I believe his explanation, which was actually I wasn't arguing with Trump on the policy front or on the philosophical front or any of this populist stuff that he was talking about. I just didn't really believe that he would deliver it. And I didn't believe that he was the best vehicle for delivering it. So it was kind of a personal thing. And I do think JD's been very consistent on the ideas front for a very long time.
I've been in Europe for a week and or a little more than a week, and we had a guy on the show this morning on the morning meeting, very serious person, military background, who said does not like Vance, does not like Vance's position on Europe. I think Vance is speaking truth to Europe in a way that the Europeans should be thanking him.
Yeah, I agree.
And again, we'll get to your book in a moment. I promise I'm not one of those hosts who keep saying we'll get to the book and then
It's a
we won't.
pleasure
We
to
we,
be
we
here
will.
regardless,
We
honestly.
will. We will. Is California needs the same thing. They need someone to speak honestly and say, you love California. You're an immigrant who chose to settle there. You recognize all the things that's strong about it, but criticizing California is not to destroy it or run it down.
Exactly.
It's to save it. And Donald Trump is trying to save NATO, and Vance is trying to save Europe. These people who you used to live amongst, particularly on the continent, it's just one Eurostar train away. They need to work harder, and they need to reorient their
Yeah.
society towards modernity, and they're not telling themselves that. It's a pity they need JD Vance to tell them, but somebody needs to tell them.
I mean, it's interesting because obviously the focus of the conversation here, for obvious reasons, is on the military defense spending, NATO, all that kind of stuff, and of course the conflict in Ukraine. But there's almost a bigger thing, which is the amazing change in the relative economic positions of Europe and America just in the last, I don't know the exact time period, let's call it 10 years or so. Is it back 10 years ago when the economies of Europe and America were basically the same size? And now we're double. That's an amazing transformation in the relative economic strength. And the sclerosis that you see in Europe, which was not in any way, I mean, it was the driver of the Brexit argument to escape from that sclerosis, for the UK to escape. It hasn't at all. It's in the same morass. And that is a really, so, I do feel that sense of, honestly, Europe, you're not in the best position to lecture us about anything.
No,
Um,
no.
extends to the economic sphere as well as military and defense.
Well, but also culture and society. Uh, you know, Europe makes Columbia University look like Liberty University. That just the amount of political correctness and focus on feelings over merit is just startling. And to me, it's actually amazing to me that they're doing as well as they are. But
Yeah.
you look around Europe for economic freedom, for a lack of political correctness. There are just not very many examples. All right, we've talked all week about the Signal story. And there are many people on this platform who say, move on, talk more about Hillary Clinton's emails and talk more about, the burning of Teslas. And I get why some people think the story's overcovered. It's a massive story. And I'm just going to show you one thing. Okay, so just to bring people up to date, in case you're one of these people who inexplicably gets your news primarily from this program. Today, the Atlantic released the screen grabs of the exchange, which yesterday we questioned whether it would ever be released, although we thought it would be. And there's information in there that if, as someone pointed out, I think this was my friend Joe Klein, there's information in there that if a newspaper or news organization had gone to the government on the front end of an attack and said, we've got this information about the attack, we'd like to publish it, the government would say, please don't, because it would threaten the operation. I don't think there's any disputing that. There's been a great effort, if you want to do a case study of how Team Trump says student body right, we're all going to say the same thing. We're all going to demonize the media. We're all going to create straw men. And from Pete Hegseth to Caroline Levitt to others, there was just this effort to say black is white, and you need to understand that it's white and don't think anything else. So the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senator Wicker, this is number 6, Sam. Senator Wicker is the chairman of Armed Services. He's a big ally of the president, talks to him regularly. He's no liberal. He's no fan of Jeffrey Goldberg. I bet he doesn't even have a subscription to the Atlantic. Okay. Here's what Senator Wicker said. The information as published recently appears to be of such a sensitive nature that based on my knowledge, I would have wanted it classified. If mistakes were made, they should be acknowledged. So I said this morning when the excerpts first came out, Steve, no fair-minded person could say that this information should have been on Signal. Just shouldn't. Just absolutely should. What the implications of that are, we can discuss. But do you agree that some of the information, despite what the Secretary of Defense is now saying, that some of that information should not have been on Signal?
So I think that honestly, I want to go to what the president's been saying, because I don't want to dismiss it, but neither has he. And I think actually, when you saw, I think it was in the cabinet room, I think he said what you would want a president to say, which is they completely owned it as a mistake. He said this shouldn't never have happened.
No, I think I got to interrupt you. As best I could tell, he's referring to the inadvertent inclusion of the reporter on the chat.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes, I understood. Okay. Yes, exactly. Let me finish that thought and I'll come back to the distinction you're making. Got it. So I think that he, to be fair, probably more than any of the others actually, has been pretty open and saying, yeah, it was a mistake, shouldn't have happened. All his language about I'd love it if we could all meet in rooms with lead walls or whatever. That would be great, but it's not realistic. So maybe we won't do this again. We need to change the way we do things. He said all that, which I think is exactly the response you would want. I don't think that in his kind of immediate reaction there, he's not blowing it off and saying black is white. I think in terms of Signal, I don't know. I was just on with Will Cain on Fox News, who's obviously close to Pete Hegseth. And I thought Will, I wasn't on to talk about this, but I heard what he had to say at the top of his show today. And I thought he made a very good case that Signal is a recommended platform by the CIA and other parts of the government, that the information that was on there, that actually even in the text, you can see that the people on there are aware of the distinction between the things that could be being shared on Signal and going to, what's the phrase they use, a high inbox or something. I can't remember what the phrase is.
Yeah, high side.
High side, right, a higher classification. In other words, they weren't being thoughtless, careless, and reckless. They genuinely seemed to think that the stuff they were talking about was okay, but there's other stuff out there, and for that, you need to go to the high side. So I don't know. It feels as if, and Will Cain made the point that actually there wasn't information there about the precise targets. It was timing, and actually the message disappears within half an hour. Look, to me, it was pretty compelling that actually this is debatable. The other point I just want to make is, I mean, obviously it's become known as Signal Gate, and we're all talking about Signal. I think there's a really important, deeper point about devices, about how we communicate. Takes me back to my first days when I was working in 10 Downing Street. I was senior advisor to David Cameron. This is 2010, so it's a while ago. But I remember very clearly the briefing from the security services that we all got, and it focused on the iPhone and the device. And they told us to be incredibly careful because basically whatever app you have, I mean, this is in the days before WhatsApp and Signal, it was early days. But they said that pretty much a hostile foreign security service can get into any device. They can even take over your device, even when it's turned off, turn it into a remote listening device for whatever room you're in. Anyway, and then people joked at the time because I never had a smartphone, and they used to mock me over this. And they said, well, what about Steve's Nokia, which is what I had at the time? And I got out my little old-fashioned Nokia, and they said, no, that's much safer. So it's something to do with the device. And by the way, not for those security reasons, but I just want to show everyone, this is my phone today. It's a little old-fashioned flip phone. And as I understand it, these are the most secure way you can communicate. So I don't know. I think that it's not just about Signal. It's about how you can create a communications platform for government officials that is secure, that works in the modern era where people are on the move and using these devices that people are addicted to.
I agree 100% with your second point. I don't agree with you on the first point, but we're not going to spend the show on it. If you want to get in on the conversation on this point or anything else, and you're here, please raise your hand and we'll get to you shortly. Do you not carry a device with you that allows you to access the internet?
Well, this laptop that I'm speaking to you on, so that's sort of with me. But basically, I haven't had a smartphone ever.
What if you're queued up at the cinema? You can't watch. You can't browse.
Oh, this is infuriating. The whole show on this, which is now, my sons mock me for using this term. I call it digital discrimination. The way that everyone is now forced to be on smartphones. You go to a concert, a gig, and your phone is your ticket. Well, what happens if you don't have a smartphone? Very annoying. Boarding passes now. It's very frustrating, but I promise you're a very calm person, and I'm already feeling agitated, Mark. So let's. Okay.
All right. We'll move topics. I want you to come back and talk about your life because I knew a little bit about you. Steve was born here, immigrant parents, and worked in British politics and in the U.S. has done a bunch of stuff. But I want you to come back and talk about that if you would. But let's talk about the book. Mm-hmm. Half the book's about what's wrong with California. Half the book's about how to fix California.
Yes.
Who's at fault for what's wrong? And again, title, Califailure, Reversing the Ruin of America's Worst Run State. It's available in bookstores now, or if you buy your books online, unlike Steve, you could read a book on your phone. You can buy it now. Who's at fault besides the Democrats for what's wrong with California? Who else would you put on the list?
Well, I think it's before we get into individuals or parties, I think the thing that's at fault is that you've had really bad ideas implemented without restraint in an environment of one party rule, which is just not healthy. And therefore there's been no real pressure to moderate or anything. So I think that's the concept. In terms of the story of how we got to that situation, I do begin the story with Ronald Reagan, who when he was in his first term as governor, was the first to grant collective bargaining rights to government unions in California. Now, at the time, it was, there was you could say it was a positive motivation. He wanted to support the police and firefighters and so on. But as the years went by, those collective bargaining rights were extended, Jerry Brown in particular, to all state employees and then all local government employees, to the point where you had this incredibly powerful block of government unions, incredibly well funded. And then, of course, they fund the Democrat politicians, and you get this lock now. And I'll give you one story that illustrates this. And then I want to answer. There's a couple of other answers to your question, but just on the unions, and people may say, "Oh, what's the big deal? Unions, Republicans always go on about government unions." My first real foray into California policymaking was a few years ago, and I'm looking at the biggest issues facing the state, and that really the underlying one is the housing crisis. It's the number one reason people are leaving California. Everything, it's the biggest component of most people's living expenses. It's just a nightmare. So I talked to lots of people, did a lot of policy research, and I don't want to get into the whole policy, but the headline was I was working on a ballot initiative to address two things: the taxes that governments levy on housing in California. They call it impact fees. The median impact fee for a housing unit in California today is $150,000 per housing unit. That's straight on the price. But the other big one, I mean, people talk about the environment, CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. It's not so much the act itself, it's the litigation that goes with it. 70% of environmental lawsuits are used to block housing. Most of those lawsuits are filed by unions. And so the ballot initiative was to remove the private right of action under CEQA. So you just add a stroke, eliminate that problem. And right now you have over 1 million housing units in California that are blocked by this kind of litigation. So it's a huge factor. I was trying to get support for this idea. I go to Sacramento, I'm talking to Democrats because they run the place, and I'm in the office of a Democrat legislator who is known to be really good on the housing issue, lay out the argument. They say, you're totally right. Completely agree. This would be the biggest change we could make that would solve the problem. And I said, great, so let's work on it together. Will you support it? We can do this bipartisan, fantastic. And they said, no, I just can't. I said, why not? I said, well, the unions will hate it. I said, I know, but like, I hear that all the time, but why not just take them on? I'll never forget what happened. We were just sitting in an office overlooking the state capitol, and just with they wave their arm like this. Well, they run this place. So that's a legislator, an elected representative saying that. It's really true in California. So you got the union problem, which was initiated by Reagan.
Why would the unions not want that housing to be built?
Because they file the lawsuits in order to get leverage over house builders, to get project labor agreements where they get rules put in place like skilled and trained, which means you can only employ union members.
So is it the government unions that are blocking it, or
no,
the
those private sector unions?
Okay.
So but also when you look at the teacher, the role of, well, if you look at the budget and the fact that, the budget of the state of California has nearly doubled in the last 10 years, everything seems to be worse. The population's falling. So much of that is going to pensions and luxury healthcare for the unions. And so we have the fiscal crisis. That's one big part of it. But the other is the actual dominant, the supermajority in the legislature, which again does not reflect the political composition of California. If you look at elections in California since the last time Republicans won, which was Schwarzenegger's re-election in 2006, I actually did the calculation. The average share of the vote for Republican statewide candidates in that 20-year period is 41.7%. And even in a bad year where you have a weak candidate that's not well funded, you regularly get over 40%. Call it 40% Republican support. In the legislature, the proportion held by Republicans is closer to 20%. And that's the direct result of gerrymandering that happened after the 2008 ballot initiative that was supposed to introduce independent redistricting, but then ended up being hijacked to draw up districts that favored Democrats. And so you've got this entrenched one-party rule. And so it's not just the fact that it's Democrats, it's the fact that you've had completely unrestrained ability for the Democrats to introduce policies that please the core powers in the party, which is the unions and the far left activists. And that's who the politicians pay attention to. So the dynamic you've seen is the legislature introducing increasingly far left and ideologically driven legislation, and the governors, both of whom I would say Jerry Brown and Gavin Newsom, are not particularly far left. I wouldn't characterize them as such. Jerry Brown fought it back a little bit, Gavin Newsom not at all. And so it's really been driven out of the legislature. And then you've had this metastasizing government bloat with all the endless, the amount of legislation that they produce. I mean, this year, just now, right? The leaders of the Assembly and the Senate, both Democrats, said, we're going to put a limit on the number of bills that legislators can introduce. And they've implemented that limit. Already this year, we've had over 2,200 bills. It's just insane, just the sheer bloat of the government. And no one's standing up to it. And so that's where you come to the word muscular, to your point earlier. We've got to challenge this and now I'd want to bring it into what Ezra Klein's been arguing with his abundance book, which I agree with nearly all of it. In fact, if you look at the policy papers that we've been publishing at my policy organization, Golden Together, I mean, they're literally called energy abundance, water abundance. I use that term all the time, but it's the Democrats who've created the scarcity, ideologically driven, especially the climate agenda. And you got to confront it. And I think structurally, it's very difficult for them to confront it because of the unions and the ideology of the activists. And there's no one that's really standing up to it.
If you want to get in on the conversation, please raise your hand. We'll get you in just a minute. Why should someone who doesn't live in California buy your book?
Well, it's a warning to the rest of the country. I mean, let's bring it back to the conversations you were having earlier this week. Maybe even this morning. I didn't listen this morning, but look at what's happening right now, where the energy is in the Democratic Party, the Bernie AOC, the crowds, that's where the energy is. You can feel it. And I mean, just to put it very simply, the Bernie AOC agenda is what we're living under in California. That's the policy agenda that's been implemented over the past decade or so, starting with the Green New Deal, everything in there we have and more. And so as we look to the midterms and think about where the Democratic Party is going and potentially, finding some success with an anti-Trump message that would implement a kind of leftward shift within the Democratic Party, I mean, that I have to say is a very, very frightening prospect when you look at just to list the failures in California. It's pretty shocking when you look at all the measures on which we are the worst performing state in America, like not just in the middle of the pack or 41 or whatever. We have the highest poverty rate, the highest housing cost, the lowest home ownership, the highest cost for gas, electricity, water, the most hostile, the worst business climate 10 years in a row, obviously the highest homelessness, the lowest income growth, the highest unemployment. I mean, for most of last year, right now we're number 2. It's just a shocking set of failures from the Bernie AOC agenda. So that's the relevance, which is this conversation about where the left is going. As there's a saying in British politics, you don't need to look into the crystal ball, where you can read it in the book. I mean, it's right there in California. And so it's a warning, I think, to the rest of the country not to let that happen.
Schwarzenegger was elected under flukish circumstances, and his celebrity and iconoclastic platform, although he was a Republican, made his election not really an indication of the resurgence of the Republican Party. Back in the olden days, Reagan, Pete Wilson, Governor Deukmejian, there were Republican governors. Hasn't been one except for Schwarzenegger in a while. I'll ask you the question I've been asking California Republicans and conservatives for a long time. Who are the 3 Republicans most likely to be the next Republican governor of California?
Well, so this is a very difficult question for me to answer, except in a very coy way. But Mark, I should tell you that I'm seriously considering running.
Yeah.
And haven't, the way I'm putting it right now is Kamala Harris is telling us that she is too, almost using that exact same language, and that she'll make a decision by the end of the summer. I'll make mine much sooner than that. So I don't think I better say anything more than that. Otherwise, it just gets into a terrible mess. But
so you don't want to name? Yeah, go ahead.
Can I address the question of Republicans generally? Because I think that there are some interesting signs that should give optimism for Republicans in California. I'm not talking about the poll that everyone got a bit excited about earlier this week. 48% of people would vote for a Republican governor, whatever. If you look at November last year, and not even the share of the number of votes that Donald Trump got, over 6 million. That number, if you project forward the turnout in a midterm election in California based on the past 2 midterms, the number of votes that Trump got in California without really campaigning in California is higher than what you would need to win in 2026. Of course, what you need to happen is the presidential level turnout, and that's not easy. But my point is that there are enough Republican voters in California to elect a Republican governor. It's not just, people say, well, how are you going to persuade Democrats and independents? Of course, you should try and do that and have a broad-based mandate. But there are actually enough Republicans in California right now to elect a Republican governor. And then, of course, you look at all the other indicators, the fact that 10 counties flipped from blue to red, including big ones like Fresno, the fifth biggest city in California, or look at Huntington Beach. I think it's very interesting. I know it's a medium-sized city, but an important one, significant culturally and so on. Surf City, USA. 4 or so years ago, the council was 6-1 Democrat, Republican. And then a friend of mine, Tony Strickland, who I've gotten to know very well, he put together a slate of candidates, worked as a team in 2022. They took control 4-3. And it was a very, strong conservative message. It wasn't some kind of watered down Democrat light. It was the opposite. It was very MAGA. And then they won 4-3 in 2022. And then they went about implementing a very conservative agenda on homelessness and crime. And they introduced a ballot initiative for voter ID, all this stuff. Just now, they took complete control. They actually called themselves the Magnificent Seven. And they won the council 7-0. So you've gone from 6-1 Democrat to 7-0 Republican in 4 years. So I think that there's something going on. I'm not saying it's easy. Of course it's not. It's going to be very difficult. But I think that California is very much in play in 2026, certainly at the statewide level, of course, because the legislature is so skewed. You've got a supermajority there. That's going to be very difficult to make much headway there in one election. But of course, if you address the gerrymandering, then immediately you increase Republican representation. Plus, by the way, very important national point here, if you address the gerrymandering in California, you probably get another 10 House seats for Republicans out of California, because the misrepresentation is just as severe for the congressional districts.
I know you don't want to name all three, but would you say you are one of the three most likely Republicans to be the next Republican governor of California?
I'm not going to go any further than
that.
Okay. Sorry to be so political about it.
Yeah, that's right. I know that people in the media often have an obsessive and unbalanced focus on two issues, abortion rights and gay marriage. But those are, in California, all the data suggests super important. Are you pro-life or pro-choice on the issue of abortion?
Well, first of all, it's not really. It's in the Constitution now, so it's not going to be an issue. But yes, I've always been in that. I mean, I would argue it differently in terms of the terminology, and there are nuances, and we can get into all that. But yes, broadly pro-choice on that issue, always have been.
Broadly pro-choice.
And I'm sorry. Yes, and
broadly pro-choice.
Yeah, and then also on the other issue. Remember, it was the Conservative government that I was working for in the UK that introduced marriage equality in the UK. So that's an indication of where I am on that issue too. So
okay, if you were governor, the legislatures you just suggested would be overwhelmingly Democratic. How would that work? How would that work? How would you confront them effectively for the good of implementing the agenda you write about in Califailure?
Well, first of all, I think there's some encouraging signs that the Democrats, even in California, do get it. I mean, you're seeing the rhetoric from Democrat leaders really shift. They are talking about the need to address cost of living and these practical things. And I very much see this whole effort as being pragmatic, not ideological. So they're showing an inclination to address this. Now, I don't think they're capable of really breaking through the structural constraints that I mentioned earlier, the unions and the ideological power of their activists. But, they're moving. You look at the abundance, Ezra Klein is very powerful. People are paying attention to that. I believe he's in California right now talking about it. So I think that there's common ground there that we could find. Remember that the government that I worked where I was senior advisor to David Cameron, it's a coalition government. It was, he was the prime minister, but it was the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats. Nick Clegg was the deputy prime minister. I helped put together the coalition agreement and actually shared an office in 10 Downing Street with my opposite number, Polly McKenzie from the Liberal Democrats. And, I know how to work together with someone from another party in order to get things done. So I think that temperamentally it's possible. I would hope you'd get that response on the other side, because if we are in a world where a Republican has been elected governor of California, that really is a political revolution. And so you would hope that Democrats in the state legislature would realize that and understand that people really strongly voted for some changes. And I therefore would expect a positive response in terms of implementing whatever agenda that Republican governor ran on.
Okay. I have a million more questions, but we're going to the group. As always, please, peace, love, and understanding. The presumption of grace for Mr. Hilton. Tell folks after you unmute where you are.
Oh my gosh, how bad is it going to be?
In case they, yeah, it's going to be awesome. It's going to be a love fest. You're going to have to flash up your number for people to donate. Tell young Kim, tell people who don't know where you are and what's on your mind for Steve.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve. So, Mark, I'm from Chappaqua, New York right now, but I wanted to ask you a question about future of California, because I grew up in California. I grew up in California. I left there about 20 years ago, and every time I go back, it just breaks my heart for the past 5+ years. Even pre-pandemic, I noticed a change, and it just kept on breaking my heart. The homeless situation was just a disaster, and I've been thinking about this. It's not a homeless problem. This is a management problem or something. It's not an issue of home issue. People, California has been spending billions of dollars on this. So this wreck of California that you describe, the question is the fire. All right. I flew in to Los Angeles on the day of the fire. And the word that came to my mind was apocalyptic. And it's not this the description of destruction, but the clearing. There's a biblical sense I got that this will reveal something about California, about the management of California. And this would change things. In other words, people in California, particularly in Los Angeles, may actually see things that they never saw before. This revelatory problem. So I just want to get your thought on that. Will the fire make any changes in the governance?
Great question.
I do think you're seeing that already. I mean, I've spent a lot of time there. I live in the Bay Area, but I've spent a lot of time there, and immediately after trying to help and put together some kind of trying to be practical suggestions over what could be done, and working with faith leaders and others and technologists to try and improve our fire response. So yeah, I've been engaged in it. And I'm now engaged in it in a more political sense in working with Nicole Shanahan on the recall of Karen Bass, because honestly, the absolute dereliction of duty and incompetence there is just shocking. And it's work. And it's not in the news so much now nationally, but every day that she's there, I'm talking to people in the Palisades and in Altadena trying to rebuild. It's just a complete nightmare. The permitting system and the circularity, you go, is it the county? No, you got to go to the city. No, you got to go to the EPA. It's on and on. No one's gripping it. No one is gripping it. And she's got to go. I think that it did wake up some people. You've seen, I've definitely had a lot of conversations with people who you hear the same thing. I've always been a Democrat, or I've never been particularly political, but we can't go on like this. This is a joke. And so I think that it really has changed something. LA, of course, is very important. Karen Bass is mayor of the city of LA, which is one of 80 or so cities within the county. But the fact that it's LA is very important politically because it's the largest county. It's 23% of California, just that one county. And so the fact that you've seen this real attention paid to the flaw, it's a combination of incompetence and mismanagement, but also it is the ideology. I mean, if you look at the reason that those fires spread so rapidly, I'm sure you've been through this many times, it's the ideological, climate-driven policy agenda that stopped people from clearing the brush near their property. You were going to be fined. People were threatened with fines if they did sensible things to protect their property and so on. So I think that it's having an impact. I don't know. It does feel like I don't think anyone should overstate it, though. I don't think it suddenly means that Democrats are going to be swept out of power, but it has opened up a conversation and made it more acceptable, I think, for people to consider political alternatives.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Young Kim, thank you very much. Appreciate you coming in. Tom, welcome in. Tell folks who don't know where you are after you unmute and what's on your mind for Steve Hilton, author of a new book, Cali Failure.
Well, thanks for calling me, Mark. Steve, watch your stuff all the time. And I am from Chicago, so I can empathize quite deeply with the experiences of California, because we have similar issues with union control of the city, of the state, and huge deficits. And thought it was kind of funny last night. I watched the thing on Cuomo between, was it Kevin Kiley and Brad Sherman?
Oh, yes.
Where I think the focus was on kind of the health insurance costs with the illegal immigrant population that's in California. But it seemed that Sherman was just completely detached from the fiscal reality of the state. And I see a similar thing here with Illinois, that there just doesn't seem to be any ability to acknowledge the problem and any desire or ability to do anything about it. And I'm kind of wondering, looking at your perspective in California, certainly what we could learn here in Illinois and try to improve things.
No, I agree. And look, the fiscal situation is a total nightmare. I mean, you look at LA City just announced a budget deficit of $1 billion. Just the city. It's insane.
Yeah.
And of course, what happens when this spending has gone out of control and there's no, I mean, I'll give you an example. So the state auditor published a report not that long ago that $24 billion of homelessness spending couldn't be tracked and had no impact on homelessness. And people say, well, how's that even possible? Well, it's because when you actually dig into it, these are all reversible policies. So, for example, California is the only state that implemented at the state level what's known as housing first, which is the concept for homelessness that people should be given housing without any requirement for treatment, whether that's for drug addiction, alcohol addiction, mental health, whatever. You just give them the apartment. It sounds sensible. Give them the apartment. Give them what's called permanent supportive housing. But again, going back to some of the things I was saying earlier, the cost per unit of that housing in California, $700,000, $800,000, $1 million in the Bay Area. And the people who then are put in the unit, because there's no requirement for their problems to be addressed, remain homeless. And in fact, I've worked with some, faith-based and nonprofits who actually reject that model, therefore do not qualify for state money. And they point out that it's basically like giving them a second home, because they're still on the streets, dealing drugs, receiving drugs, because they're addicted and so on. So when the question is like, how do we have this fiscal crisis all the time? Because the money is just being wasted, because there's just a sort of softness about that. No one's challenging the waste. And I think that, and then when you look at the unions, I mean, you have unions in California made all these strong arguments for Obamacare, but it's not good enough apparently for their own members. And so you have what's called OPEB, other post-employment benefits, huge escalation in cost there, luxury healthcare for union members and retirees, way in excess of what Obamacare, which they said was the best thing ever, provides. And so you've just got to confront some of this stuff. And of course, a politician that is elected with the money of the unions is never going to be able to do that.
Yep. Tom, thank you. Appreciate it, Tom. Thank you. Patty, welcome, and tell folks who don't know where you are. Question for Steve Hilton.
Hi, Steve. I'm so happy to hear about everything you're saying. I lived in California, I beg your pardon, for 40 years, left in 2010. And 2010 was, California is so multi-layered in terms of issues. I was in the Los Angeles County area. First of all, I think Los Angeles County is too big. Mm-hmm. If there were any way to split it up, it would be, they'd do everybody a favor, because it's too behemoth. You just can't get anything done. It's like a dinosaur in terms of lack of mobility. How important do you think, because one of the issues that really started to get to me, besides, because homelessness wasn't as bad as it is now, the immigrant issue was starting because we had all kinds of workers that lined the streets, looking, in the mornings, they'd take over a neighborhood in terms of looking for jobs. They'd just be lining Ventura Boulevard. But traffic is also a gigantic issue. And there was all that money spent for decades on that high-speed rail. How much influence, because maybe this is just my lack of knowledge in terms of what being a governor is, because there is so much inefficiency on the Los Angeles county level that I don't think you can, I don't know how much you can do about. What do you think you can do on a local level that, I mean, on it, you know, from a government level that can start to impact a lot of those issues?
Well,
Patty,
Gavin,
thank you.
thank you very much. Great question. And you're right about the size of LA, 5 supervisors for 10 million people. It's, you know, it's a lot. I think that Gavin Newsom has shown that he's got a very strong appetite for getting involved in county and local matters, for example, on issues like housing, just not in the right way. And I think that, honestly, there is so much frustration with what's going on. I mean, if you look, I mean, you talk about jobs and work. I think I'm all the time speaking to business owners, particularly small business owners. I used to run, one of the things that I've done in the past, Mark, when you're going through my resumes, I started a restaurant in London, ran a couple of restaurants. It's a really tough business. And so I think restaurant owners really on the sharp end, and bar owners and local businesses like that, of all this nonsense they have to do, you know, the regulations, the labor regulations, minimum wage, environmental regulations, the permits, inspections, fees, all this stuff, right? And I think there's and it's coming from multiple places. I mean, I'll give you a specific example. The other day I was talking to a lady who runs a pest control company in the Sierras and employs about 15 people. And she said, it's just a nightmare in terms of the bureaucratic compliance. Give me examples. She said, well, we have to report on everything. And we have to send in these reports about everything we're doing all the time. And we have to send one report to the state pesticide control board, or whatever it's called. And then we have to send it to the agriculture commissioner, or whatever it's called, for each county that we operate in. And we operate in 9 counties. So we report it. I said, oh my God, every year you have to send this in. No, every month. And each of the government entities has a different method of doing it. Some you can upload, some you have to do paper. It's all different. It's a nightmare. Another guy I met, machine tool company, said he spends $200,000. He spends $180,000 a month paying his workers, $200,000 a month on regulatory compliance. So there's so much frustration about all of this. I mean, another one, a winery in wine country, she was telling me that she wanted to expand. This is in the story. These stories are in the book in California. She wanted to expand her permitted visitor numbers per day from 30 to 50. Built a new patio. She wanted a permit for that. It took 6 years and $1 million. And of course, you have Bill Maher on his show talking about the nightmare he went through with his garden shed or whatever it was. I think there's so much frustration for this. And you do have a template now of what happened with the pandemic, the emergency rule. And, you know, as I argued at the time, that was used for a negative purpose, to shut down the economy, shut down schools, totally. I don't want to get back into the COVID arguments, but, you know, that was very strong imposition of a kind of centralized approach to local and county matters. And my argument would be, okay, well, that's the model. So we can be aggressive, muscular, to use that word, in liberating Californians and business owners from all this nonsense, so that we can be the best of America, which we should be, not the worst. I mean, sorry, to one last point. Democrats make the point, Gavin Newsom makes the point the whole time, that, you know, we can't be doing that badly because we're the 5th biggest economy in the world if we were a country. And that's true. I'm super proud of that as a Californian. But imagine how well we'd be doing without all this nonsense, without the most hostile business climate in America. We'd be absolutely sensational. And that's what we need to get to.
Okay, Patty, thank you for coming in. Meldrick, welcome in. Tell folks who don't know where you are what's on your mind for Steve.
Hi, I'm from Colorado. I could go into the signal thing because I've been in IT a long time and worked for the DoD. I currently work for the DoD, but I had a question for Steve about conservatorship in California, because
Yes.
my understanding, listening to Dr. Drew, I'm sure you're familiar with him, addiction specialist, one of the big problems is not being able to forcibly take these mentally ill or drug addicted people and get them treatment. There's just no way to do that forcibly. How would you address that? Because I know it's a touchy subject with freedom and, you know, civil liberties. Understand that. So,
well, it's a great question. So there's 2 aspects to this. There's the requirement and also there's the availability of the treatment. On the requirement front, actually, there was just a bill passed and signed by Gavin Newsom just last year on conservatorship, which makes it easier to do this than it was before. It was pretty controversial. I don't think it goes far enough, but it's there now, so you can use it. And in Proposition 36, which was passed overwhelmingly in November, 70% majority in every county, which reversed some of the worst effects of Prop 47, which became notorious. It was one that basically legalized theft up to $950 a day. There's a treatment mandated offense. There's for drugs and other treatment for, especially I think with homeless people in mind, who are in a cycle of crime, particularly, robbery and theft in order to fund their drug addiction. And so there's that's a new penalty that's available to prosecutors to use as of January, when it became law. But none of that works if you don't have treatment facilities, if you don't have the beds available. And this is the really big problem, is that, and Gavin Newsom blames, when he talks about this, he always goes back to Ronald Reagan. I've noticed Ronald Reagan closed the mental hospitals. And it's just a totally unfair critique, because what happened is there's, ever since the beginning of Medicaid, this all goes back to the funding of mental health treatment. And a lot of it is funded through Medicaid. And since the origin of Medicaid, there has been, which was in roughly at that same time when there was concern about large mental institutions in the late 1960s, mid 1960s, there has been a limit on the number of beds for any institution to get Medicaid reimbursement. It's very technical, but it really affects the provision, because if you can't get reimbursed, counties don't want to fund the service. And so that limit is 16 beds. It's very precise. It's the IMD limit, Institutions for Mental Disease. And you just can't get funding. And so that's meant that it's inefficient to have something so small. And so modern mental health treatment hospitals, which today, with all our knowledge and compassion, could provide at a much bigger scale, much more efficiently, they don't qualify for Medicaid reimbursement. However, the Trump administration, the first time round, instituted a waiver so states could avoid that limit. And other states have done that. California has not. It's a very simple technical policy fix that would immediately make it easier to set up the kind of mental health provision that we need, that is necessary if you're going to have that forced treatment. There's no point forcing someone off the street if you've got nowhere to treat them. So you've got to get both sides of it right.
Thank you for the question. Appreciate it. Thank you for coming in. Come back tomorrow, talk about Signal, because we'll talk more about that. Steve, what's the best Beach Boys song and why?
Oh, so there was one that I cried. I can't remember. We went to see the Beach Boys, July the 4th, Hollywood Bowl, 2 years ago, I think. Fireworks. It was so magical for me, and I literally cried. And I'm now trying to remember. It was one of the classics.
In my room.
No, it was one of the main hit. I don't know. Oh, Good Vibrations. It was Good Vibrations.
Good Vibrations, yeah.
It was Good Vibrations.
Yeah.
And I literally found myself in tears. So there you go.
Who are the best two California governors of the last 50 years?
Oh my goodness. Well, I wasn't there, so I've only got Jerry Brown. Okay, I'm going to give you a weird answer. I read a really great book, The Browns of California, about Pat Brown and Jerry Brown, and I really liked them both from that book. Pat Brown seemed amazing, and Jerry Brown, the first time around, seemed super interesting, actually. Less so the second time around. So I'm going to go with the two Browns. I'll probably get in such trouble for saying that. I'm just saying they were interesting, okay? I'm not saying they were the best.
Okay. What's the best thing Gavin Newsom's done as governor?
Oh gosh, I can't think. There must be something. I have said I've agreed with him on things. I can't think. I don't know.
All right. When you come back, you'll tell us.
Yeah, I should be able to think of something. It's a great question.
Yeah. Okay.
I know him, actually. I know him a little bit. He's I think the fundamental defect, as I mentioned earlier, is just not standing up to the left. I think that is the big problem.
Yeah. Larry King would say, the book. The book is Cali Failure.
Yes.
Reversing the Ruin of America's Worst Run State by Steve Hilton. Mr. Hilton, so glad you joined us. And again, I really want you to come back because I got a lot of questions about your life I want to ask you. So thank you for making the hour for us, and please come back.
I'd love that. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Have a great day. Thank you again. Good luck with the book. Tomorrow, as I said, 9 a.m. Eastern time, Dan Sean and I will be here for the morning meeting. Then at 10 o'clock Eastern time, opportunity to talk to David Bahnsen of the Bahnsen Group about the economy. A lot of uncertainty out there now, and David will answer your questions to try to provide some of a sort of roadmap to the future of what you can expect. And again, if you haven't already, I'd ask you to sign up for David's newsletter. It's free. It's called the Dividend Cafe. You can both sign up for the newsletter and register to attend tomorrow's event, only available on the two-way platform, not available on YouTube or X, by going to our website, twoway.tv/TBG, the Bahnsen Group. Then later in the day, you can join Michael Moynihan at 4 o'clock and me at 6 o'clock for this program. Very grateful to all of you for joining, for Mr. Hilton, for spending the hour with us. And I will see you at 9 a.m. Eastern time for the morning meeting. Have a great night, everybody.